The tactical training camp was a place built on noise. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots, the barked orders of drill sergeants, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing across the valley. For Ilara Vance, a girl who had always found solace in silence, it was a constant, jarring assault on her senses. She was a ghost in a sea of living, breathing soldiers, her presence so understated that men twice her size often walked right past her without a second glance. She was here for a simple, bleak reason. She was running out of options. Her parents, exhausted by her quiet withdrawal from the world after her grandfather's passing, had seen a brochure for the camp and thought it might build character. Ilara hadn't argued. She had simply packed her bag, her fingers tracing the faint, engraved lines on a small metal box she kept hidden in her duffel. It held her grandfather's last gift, 3 perfectly milled, hand-cast bullets, each a miniature sculpture of brass and lead, a token of a shared, secret life that no one else in her family had ever understood. The camp was run by Sergeant Major Graves, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard living, scarred by wind, sun, and the 1,000 silent battles he'd fought in places no one ever talked about. His voice was a permanent, gravelly roar, a weapon he used to chip away at the recruits' confidence, until all that was left was raw, compliant obedience. On the first day of shooting practice, he was in his element, pacing behind the firing line with the casual menace of a predator. "Listen up, grunts," he bellowed, his voice carrying effortlessly over the low chatter. "This ain't no video game. This is the one and only truth. The bullet don't lie. You get lazy, you get sloppy, you miss. And out there, missing means someone dies. Maybe you. Maybe your buddy. Maybe some poor kid in a town 1,000 miles from nowhere." He stalked along the line, inspecting each recruit's rifle. He stopped at a young man named Jensen, a preening loudmouth, who had already tried to hit on Ilara twice. Jensen's rifle was gleaming, pristine. Graves sneered, grabbed it, and slammed it against a workbench. A few scratches appeared, and Jensen winced. "Too pretty," Graves grunted. "You babying it. This is a tool, not a toy." He continued his intimidating circuit until he reached Ilara. She stood still, shoulders back, her gaze fixed on the paper target 100 yards downrange. Her rifle, a standard issue AR-15, felt alien in her hands. The weight was wrong, the balance off. It was a machine she hadn't yet learned to speak to. She had been taught a different language. Graves stopped. He looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. He'd barely noticed her until now. She was a flicker of movement, a ghost in his peripheral vision. He saw the way she held the rifle, a rigid, unnatural grip, and a cynical smile creased his lips. This was a city girl, a civilian pretending to be a soldier, a chance to make an example. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous hush that made the recruits around them stand straighter. "Let me see your piece." Ilara didn't flinch. She presented the rifle. Graves snatched it from her, his fingers expertly checking the stock, the scope, the barrel. He saw nothing particularly wrong, but a new, more cruel idea sparked in his mind. He turned and walked to a pile of decommissioned weapons, relics of countless training sessions. He picked up a rifle, a scarred, beat-up thing, with a chipped stock and a barrel that looked slightly warped. He brought it back and shoved it into her hands. "This one's for you, Vance." The last guy to use it couldn't hit the broad side of a barn. Maybe you'll have better luck. The other recruits snickered. Jensen let out a loud, theatrical laugh. Don't worry, Vance. You can just throw the bullets at the target. Might be more accurate. Ilara's fingers closed around the cold metal of the rifle. Her knuckles didn't whiten. Instead, a strange calm settled over her. The rifle was a monstrosity of a weapon. The stock was cracked near the butt plate, giving it a subtle, unstable vibration. The bolt action was sticky, requiring a hard jerk to cycle. The barrel had a barely perceptible bend, a flaw, that would send any shot veering off course by a significant margin. But as her hands gripped the worn wood and cold steel, she didn't feel its brokenness. She felt its story. The way her grandfather had taught her to feel the grain of the wood, the weight of the steel, the unique, living personality of every firearm. She turned to face the target, a simple black circle on a white background. She lowered herself into the prone position, her body automatically adjusting. Graves watched, his arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face. He was waiting for the inevitable, the first wild shot, the one that would land a foot to the left, a sign of her utter incompetence. He'd give her a choice, try to fix it, or give up. Either way, he'd have proven his point. Ilara didn't look through the scope. Her grandfather had always said the best marksmen didn't aim with their eyes, but with their heart. He'd said the rifle was an extension of your own nervous system. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deep, smelling the dry earth and the acrid scent of gunpowder. She felt the rifle's imperfections. The stubborn bolt, the cracked stock that would throw a shudder through her shoulder. The warped barrel that would push the bullet to the left. She didn't see these as flaws. She saw them as coordinates, a language she was fluent in. She opened her eyes, and her gaze was no longer on the target. It was on the point just to the right of the center, a tiny, almost invisible speck of white. She took a breath, held it, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The recoil was heavier and more unbalanced than it should have been, just as she'd felt it would be. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack that made Graves flinch, not from surprise, but from the sheer percussive imperfection of the weapon. A second of silence hung in the air. The other recruits were still, watching. Jensen was stifling a laugh. Then, the target flashed. A small, bright disk of white appeared in the exact center of the black bullseye, dead center. A low murmur rippled through the line. Graves's smirk didn't disappear, but it shifted into a look of mild annoyance. A fluke. It had to be a fluke, a lucky shot. He'd seen them before. The universe occasionally smiled on the undeserving, just to keep things interesting. Begin again, Vance. He roared, a little too loudly. Don't think for a second you got lucky. Ilara didn't respond. She cycled the bolt, a deliberate, forceful jerk that scraped against the rusty action. Another breath, another moment of stillness. Her eyes fixed on the new, infinitesimal target, a tiny point on the black circle that, for all intents and purposes, was the only place the bullet could go. Crack. The sound was the same. The recoil was the same. The result was not. The second shot landed so close to the first that the small white disc seemed to simply get larger. Tote. It wasn't just a bullseye. It was a grouping. 2 bullets in almost the same exact spot. This time, the murmur was louder. Jensen's grin had vanished. Graves's face was beginning to lose its color. His eyes, which had been so full of casual contempt, now held a glint of genuine confusion. This was not a lucky shot. A lucky shot could be a bullseye. 2 shots in the same hole with a perfect working rifle was a sign of skill. 2 shots in the same hole with that rifle was a different kind of miracle. "Keep firing," Graves yelled. The command lacked its usual force. It was more a request for an explanation than an order. Ilara fired again. Crack, bullseye. And again crack, bullseye, and again crack, bullseye. The silence that had settled on the firing line was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. All eyes were on Ilara, this quiet girl who had seemed so out of place. She fired 5 rounds in total. 5 perfect bullseyes, a grouping so tight it looked like a single, jagged hole in the center of the target. She didn't look up once. She simply followed the rhythm, the language her grandfather had taught her. A silent conversation between her body and the broken, beautiful weapon in her hands. When she was finished, she calmly cycled the bolt one last time, ejecting the spent casing. She placed the rifle on the bench, not with a dismissive clatter, but with a gentle, almost reverent touch. Then she rose and stood at attention, her gaze still fixed on the target, as if waiting for a final judgment. Graves walked to the target. He didn't run, didn't shout. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace that spoke of a man whose entire worldview had just been detonated. He stood before the target, his massive frame dwarfing the flimsy paper. He reached out a gnarled finger and traced the outline of the single, gaping hole in the center. He knew guns. He knew the way they felt, the way they moved, the way a perfectly zeroed, clean rifle would shoot. But this was different. He turned and looked at Ilara, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying realization. He was no longer the arrogant sergeant major. He was just a man looking at something that defied all logic, all reason. He walked back to her, his boots making no sound on the gravel. He stopped just a foot away, forcing her to look at him. His voice was a whisper, a stark contrast to his usual bellow. "Who taught you to shoot like that, kid?" Ilara's gaze was steady. "My grandfather, sir." "Your grandfather," he repeated, the name a foreign word on his tongue. "What was his name?" "Silas Vance." The name hit Graves like a physical blow. He staggered back, his jaw slackening. Silas Vance. "The gunsmith of the Blue Ridge." Ilara nodded. The legend of her grandfather, a reclusive master gunsmith, who could take a pile of scrap metal and forge a weapon that could hit a coin from 1,000 yards away, was something she had always known. She just hadn't realized anyone outside their small, secluded community had known of him. "He taught me to feel the rifle, sir," she said quietly. "He used to give me the broken ones to practice on. He said the perfect weapon doesn't teach you anything. The broken ones, they tell you their story. And if you listen, you learn how to make them sing." Graves stared at her, not just seeing a recruit anymore, but a living ghost, a conduit to a man he had thought was a myth. Silas Vance. He remembered the stories. A sniper in the military's most elite covert operations. A man who had vanished from the world after a mission went wrong, only to reappear years later as a hermit living in the mountains, taking apart and rebuilding guns with a skill that bordered on sorcery. He looked at the weapon she had just used, the one he had handed her as a joke. He knew exactly what was wrong with it. He had picked it out precisely for its flaws. The cracked stock would send a vibration through the rifle every time it fired, making it almost impossible to hold a steady point of aim. The warped barrel would naturally cause the bullet to drift an inch or two to the left, over 100 yards. For her to compensate for both, to not just aim but to know the exact degree of correction needed on the first shot and every shot thereafter, was an act of pure genius. Graves took the rifle and held it, turning it over in his hands. He felt the minute tremor in the cracked stock. He ran a finger down the barrel, feeling the subtle, almost undetectable curve. He had thought he was a good shot. He had thought he was an expert. But what he held in his hands wasn't a gun anymore. It was an instrument of precision. A violin he could only pluck a single note on, but she had made it sing a symphony. From that day forward, everything changed for Ilara. She was no longer a ghost. She was a legend. The other recruits stopped snickering and started watching her with a silent, respectful awe. Jensen, the loudmouth, was humbled into a state of permanent quiet observation. Graves, the man who had terrified her, became her shadow. He didn't shout anymore. He spoke to her in low, respectful tones. He spent hours with her at the range, bringing out every kind of broken or flawed weapon he could find, his voice filled with a desperate curiosity. "What about this one, Vance? The scope's off by a millimeter. The firing pin has a hairline fracture. What do you see?" Ilara would take the weapon, close her eyes, and feel it. She would talk to it, not with her voice, but with her intuition. "The bolt's sticky. It'll kick a little to the right on the first shot. I'll have to account for that. The trigger's a little soft. I'll need to pull it back with more intention to get a clean break." Her grandfather's voice, a quiet murmur she had thought was lost forever, was suddenly everywhere. In the feel of the wood, the weight of the metal, the smell of the gunpowder. She wasn't just a shooter. She was an interpreter of a hidden, mechanical language. Graves, once her bully, became her champion. He pulled her aside one day, his face serious. "Vance," he said, "your talent, it's a gift. But a gift is useless if it's just a trick. We're going to make it a tool." He began training her in a way no one else was being trained. He taught her to shoot in the wind, in the rain, at night. He had her fire from uncomfortable positions, with unstable footing, with a half-dozen distractions designed to break her concentration. But Ilara never wavered. Her grandfather's training, in the quiet, isolated woods of the Blue Ridge, had prepared her for this more than any standardized camp ever could. The climax came in the form of a simulated high-stakes mission. The target was a small, red flag, no larger than a postcard, held by a mechanical arm on top of a 3-story building, swaying gently in the wind. The challenge wasn't just the distance, or the movement, or the wind. The challenge was the rifle. Graves handed her an antique bolt-action, with a custom-machined barrel that he himself had designed. A weapon so meticulously flawed, it was almost a work of art. The barrel had a rifling twist that was subtly off, designed to make the bullet spin just enough to stabilize it for the first 50 yards, and then send it into a subtle, graceful curve to the left. The only way to hit the target was to account for the curve to shoot, not at the target, but at the empty space to the right of it, a feat of ballistic intuition. That was mathematically impossible, and yet for Ilara was as simple as breathing. She took the rifle. She felt the subtle, deliberate flaw in the barrel, the elegant error that Graves had designed. Her eyes closed for a moment as she let the rifle tell her its story. When she opened them, her gaze was not on the red flag. It was on a point of empty air, a point she had to imagine in her mind, a point only she could see. She held her breath, squeezed the trigger. Crack. The bullet flew. The other recruits watched, their eyes on the red flag. The bullet seemed to be heading into a vacuum of empty air, a foot to the right of the target. Then, with a silent, almost imperceptible grace, it began its turn, a subtle, smooth curve that defied all the laws of physics they had been taught. It hit the red flag, not just on the tip, but in the exact center, punching a clean hole through the fabric. Graves, standing beside her, didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face, a mix of utter relief and profound reverence, said it all. He had seen the myth of Silas Vance come alive, not as a gunsmith, but as a marksman. He had found his master. Ilara Vance, the quiet girl who had come to the camp with no purpose, had found her calling in the most unlikely of places. She had learned to speak the language of steel and gunpowder, a language of beautiful, controlled destruction. She had found her place, not as a soldier or a recruit, but as a master of her craft, a girl who could make the impossible seem as simple as a whisper. And she did it all with a rifle that everyone else had believed was broken.